Who just came on?
Morning, Joe. I haven't seen you in a while.
Oh, that's true. Like I told the rabbi, I can't see you guys.
Well, you'll see us soon. Well, okay.
And that's because it forced me to press twice on join with video.
Well,
And then, huh?
I'm going to mute myself too.
morning, Joel. Good to see you. Okay. Okay. Almost there. Almost there. Okay. And now here. Okay. It's off the blog. And gotta put it on LinkedIn. Okay, post. Okay. And one more thing, and we'll get started. Some mornings. Okay, 1 minute. Okay. One moment, please. Where are we? Okay. Okay, that's taken care of. And one more second. Okay. 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 So we are presently on page 24. You'll see me in a moment. Where hello, Michael, hello, Bobby, hello, Yossel. And we are presently on page 24. And we were discussing that even matters that are not necessarily practical. The halachic man is concerned with the theoretical halacha, with the truth for its own sake. So we're on page 24. We're in chapter 6. Roman numeral 6, which began, and we were studying last week, it began on page 19, but we're now on page 24, and I had sent out a few times the link to the online thing that Natalie found for us. Natalie has been very busy, so she's not been with us for a while. So theoretical halacha, not the practical decision. The ideal creation, not the empirical one, represents the longing of halachic man. So you see, in other words, the truth, whether it applies to in other words, the stuff of halacha is the stuff of the real world. But it's possible that a halacha might not have been in use for 1,500 years. It's no less relevant. Halachic man engages in theory. And by the way, this is the whole idea of limud haTorah, the whole idea of learning Torah for its own sake, that learning Torah, that pursuing the truth is an end in itself. There we are. So the theoretical halacha, not the practical decision, the ideal creation, not the empirical one, represents the longing of halachic man. Halachic man engages in theoretical discussion and debate concerning the sacrifices, purity, and plumbs the depths of those concepts and laws and distinctions with the same seriousness he investigates and searches out the law of aguna, a woman whose husband has disappeared, plaintiff and defendant, and forbidden foods. The yeshiva of Volozhin introduced the study of the entire Talmud from beginning to end, from brachot to nida, in place of the previous practice of skipping over those tractates which are not li'odos that are practiced nowadays. Rabbi Soloveitchik, his grandfather, aside from his regular lecture at the yeshivas of Volozhin, would deliver a parallel lecture on the tractates of Achim, animal offerings, and Menachot, meal offerings. When he would deliver a lecture on the tractate Eruvin, partitions vis-a-vis Shabbat laws, he also dealt with the Mishnaic treatise Olot, which concerns with partitions vis-a-vis the laws of corpse defilement, which are not so relevant today unless you're a Kohen. When he studied the tractate Brachot, which dealt with agricultural laws, he also dealt with agricultural laws, even those laws, in as much as they are dependent upon the land of Israel, are not practiced outside the land. A significant part of his halachic novella, in other words, his writings of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who lived at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th, is devoted to laws of sacrifice and purity and defilement, even though those had not really been relevant for 1900 years. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, acted in a similar fashion as many Torah giants before and after them. This stance has been their fundamental characteristics of halachists from time immemorial. So does anyone want to comment on this? In other words, the idea is that the pursuit of divine knowledge, the pursuit of the knowledge of the Torah, the pursuit of the precise details of the laws of sacrifices, even though they're not relevant to the halachic man, is because, again, his world is the world of halacha. The world of halacha relates entirely to the real world, but the fact that there may not be a real world application doesn't bother him the least bit, nor does it make that study less of a priority for him. So does anyone want to comment, ask questions, and so on? This is a good place to pause.
I would like to mention something because I know that Rashi was involved in that, and he even came under criticism because I think he said that the only reason we in the Galut, outside the land of Israel, when we are putting on tefillin or doing all kind of mitzvot, it's nothing but a practice for the day when we come back to Eretz Israel. And that raised a lot of problems.
Yeah, but you're blaming the wrong person.
I know that
you're blaming the wrong person, my friend. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so because Rashi is quoting a medrash that says that all the mitzvot we do outside Israel are tziyunim, they're signs for the mitzvot that we'll do in Israel when the temple is rebuilt. And we're merely saying that when, it's sort of like critical mass. When you're able to do all the mitzvot as you are when the temple is rebuilt and we all live in Israel, so then all the mitzvot increase their intensity. So it's like it's like if you have a weak circuit in several parts of a electrical system, the whole system works slower. So the idea is that all the mitzvot are not on the same level of, shall we say, spiritual enlightenment that they will be in the land of Israel, where with the coming of Mashiach and the building of the temple. That's what that medrash means, and that's what Rashi means. But and the idea is, and more than that, even in ordinary, even before the temple's rebuilt, the prayer or tefillin or Torah study in the land of Israel have an added dimension to them, because as I explained at length Thursday night in my talk about Israel, that the land of Israel is a fundamental aspect of the Jewish faith, and everything there is enhanced, and everything outside is somewhat weakened. That's the idea.
Well,
but tell me how you want to plug it into what we're learning here. And by the way, this is the point, that the laws related to the land of Israel remain alive. They remain true. They remain an intrinsic part of the divine truth that we have to pursue, even though we can't actually do them. That's Rabbi Soloveitchik's point, that to the halachic man, the halacha in its ideal state, even if we can't do it, is relevant, because to know the truth of the Torah is a goal in itself. That truth of the Torah is tied up with the real world. So the laws of sacrifices have to do with sheep and with goats and with the temple and with the altar and with the knife and so on and so forth. But in the end, the fact that it's not happening practically right now is irrelevant, because the truth remains. And and the midrash that Rashi quotes, that you also quoted, I think really illustrates that point.
Well, to me, that somehow definitely connects to what Rabbi Soloveitchik is saying, and I think
just one moment, Dan. A few classes ago, I posted the. Did you own the book, Halachic Man, Dan? I'm talking to Dan.
I don't know. I have it, but
No. But I'm just saying. So we posted a link to it. If you don't have it, I'll post it again for next week.
I have it.
No, I'm talking to Dan. Dan just logged on.
Oh.
Okay. So, but if not, we'll just read along, because I have to renew my lease. I'm not able to bring it up right now. Okay. So go ahead, Joe.
So that to me has something to do with, we are praying about the land of Israel, and Rashi, I can even prove it to you that he did say.
No, Rashi said it. He's quoting a medrash.
Yeah, okay. But to me, what that means, somehow, that if you keep on saying that we do everything to remind us, so we don't forget what we should be doing when we go back to Israel, at the same time, the same group of people didn't do anything to encourage going back to Israel.
Well, you can't blame Rabbi Soloveitchik.
They became anti-Zionist.
Rabbi Soloveitchik was never an anti-Zionist. He joined Mizrahi early.
Yeah,
okay. Anyways, good. Yeah, and remember one thing, Joe.
He wasn't.
Joe, I want you to remember one thing: that going back to the land of Israel is not exclusively a Zionist enterprise. The first large group of European Jews to come to Israel were the Hasidim and the two students of the Vilna Gaon in the late 1700s, early 1800s.
Yeah. They came to die. They came to die in Israel.
No, they didn't come to die. They came to live. They came to start businesses. It's not true. It isn't true. They're the ones who expanded Jewish Jerusalem.
Well, okay.
Montefiore was not a Zionist, but he was very active in building neighborhoods in Israel. I'm not done yet. And then the Gerach Hasidim made a big migration. They brought as many people as they could. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who nominally was not a Zionist, built multiple cities in Israel, multiple yeshuvim, and brought thousands of Russian Jews and others to Israel. And as you know, there are more Chabadniks in Israel than anywhere else in the world. You know that. So he wasn't nominally a Zionist, but his
Yeah, I
Chassidim served
know.
in the army, and he built towns and villages and brought tens of thousands of people to Israel. So it's not just the Zionists, Yossel.
Oh, come on, Rabbi.
Listen,
Let's not get there because
Joe. But remember one thing: when we're
they
talking,
didn't build anything.
we're
There's
talking
nothing
about
there.
the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I know a thing or two. I knew him.
Okay.
I know more than a thing or two. Okay, let's. But at any rate, Rabbi Soloveitchik, very actively, he was a very early member of Mizrahi. So
Yes, I know. So was my father.
good. So there
Early.
you are. Okay.
And for that matter, so was I. The first time that I could vote, I was in the army in Israel, and I voted Mizrahi.
Very good. And what election was that?
That had to be in the middle 50s.
Okay, so do you remember in the middle 50s, Mizrahi was part of a Chazit Datit Muchedet?
Yeah, they used to be called Mafdal eventually.
No, but Mafdal, in the 50s, there were two elections where they ran together with other religious parties.
This I cannot comment on.
Well, anyways, they'd had a vote sharing thing. And anyways, so let's go on. We're on page 25, the first paragraph that begins on the page. So Rashi, the Tosafists, and other Ashkenazic and Sephardic scholars devoted a large part of their prodigious powers also to matters that are not practiced nowadays. Maimonides, in his great code of law, Yad HaChazaka, codified all the laws of the Torah from the first Mishnah in Brachot to the last Mishnah in Uktzin, and he dealt with all matters pertaining to the temple in Israel and so on. And with the same precision and the same rigorous standards that he used in determining the law in the case of a man who lent money to his fellow and said, "Don't pay me except in the presence of so-and-so," which is a law applicable today, or in the case of a man who deposited with his fellow an unmeasured mass of produce, and the Bailey commingled it with his own produce without measuring it, the Bailey meaning the person who is obliged to watch it. That's a legal term. It's not beetle. Or in the case of a Bailey who was negligent with regard to landed property, etc., laws that are bound up with the everyday life of our people. He also treated with the same seriousness the order of the service of the high priest on the Day of Atonement, the law of the Passover sacrifice, the disqualification of certain sacrifices brought about being left overnight, Nazarite chip, the red heifer, the defilement of the corpse and the leper, etc. Will the mathematician worry that the ideal irrational number doesn't correspond to a real number? Both the halachist and the mathematician live in an ideal realm and enjoy the radiance of their own creation. When a person understands and grabs any halacha, now something very interesting is going to happen over here, because you know where the next quote is from.
Rabbi, before we go to the next quote,
yes, my son.
I stopped in the. So here, for example, is an interesting way of the way he's putting it. Prodigious powers. Okay, so he's talking about the greats. No matter to matters that are not practiced nowadays. So, do you realize what that means? Practice now, not. So, in other words, we used to do things, and now we're not doing them. We're not practicing them. And it sounds like this is today. If you say something like this, it sounds like you are goy. What do you mean?
We can't. No, Yossel, you're going off on a tangent here, because these are mitzvot dealing with the Beit HaMikdash that we can't do because we don't have a Beit HaMikdash. That's what Rabbi Soloveitchik's talking about.
Well, first of all, he's not saying it so obvious that I
he
can
is everyone.
See it.
Joe, every one of these laws that he just mentioned deals with the Beit HaMikdash. I'm telling you, he knows his stuff, the man. These are all dealing with the Beit HaMikdash.
I'm sure he did.
Right, so he's dealing with the Beit HaMikdash. Now he's going to quote the nature of the purpose of Torah being the purpose of knowing the mind of God, and Rabbi Soloveitchik, the spiritual heir of the Vilna Gaon, the scion of the house of Brisk, he's going to support his position from none less than the Tanya of Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, the fundamental intellectual work of Hasidism, the founder of Chabad. So the next piece is from the Tanya. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, by the way, with everything else he knew, was also expert in the Tanya and the other writings of Reb Shneir Zalman. And
you just said something very interesting. You just said that you were trying to understand or read the mind of God. I mean, that sounds so strange to me.
Why did you?
Since when are we reading the mind of God?
Let's read the piece, Joe. Let's read the piece, and then you'll see.
Okay, let's read the piece.
When a person understands and grasps any halacha in the Mishnah or Gemara fully and clearly, and now this halacha is the wisdom and will of the Holy One, blessed be He. In other words, you don't know God's mind, but you know what God wants and what God's wisdom says. Because since halacha is God's will, because God told us in the Torah to follow the teachings of the rabbis, so when the Mishnah and the Gemara say something, this halacha is the wisdom and will of the Holy One, blessed be He. For it is His will that in case Ruvain pleads thus and Shimon thus, the decision should be thus. And even if such a case involving these particular pleas never came before a court and will never come, nevertheless, since it has been the will and the wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, that in case a person pleads thus, if it were to happen, and another person pleads thus, and we're turning to page 26, then the decision shall be thus. Therefore, when a person knows and grasps with his intellect his decision in accordance with the laws set forth in the Mishnah, Gemara, or codes, he thereby comprehends, grasps, and encompasses with his intellect the will and wisdom of the Holy One, blessed be He, whom no thought can grasp. You're right, Joe. No one can know God's mind. But God chose to condense His will and wisdom into the Torah. And since it's God's will that if Ruvain says X and Shimon says Y, Shimon gets the money, since it's God's will that this is chametz and this isn't chametz, how do we know it's God's will? Because God told us to follow the Torah as interpreted by the sages in Parshat Shoftim. So therefore, it's God's will. So therefore, when you study a law in the Torah, even a simple law like you make shahakol on candy, that law is the will and wisdom of God, and you have now encompassed and made part of your being God's very mind, God's very will and wisdom, because that's what the Torah is. So the goal, Rabbi Soloveitchik is telling us here, using the Tanya, that the goal of studying Torah is to become one with God by making God's wisdom and will part of our mind, part of our being. And that's an end in itself because we become united with God. That's the purpose of the halachic man. If it has practical application, matov u'manoyim. But the goal is to know the truth of God's will and wisdom, thereby becoming one with God. That is why Jews are so obsessed with Torah study. And now he's going to explain very beautifully. The concept of the Day of Atonement or the night of Passover, for example, is an ideal concept. An halachic man sees the Day of Atonement in the resplendent image of the glory of the sacrificial service of the day. You know, on Yom Kippur, we read the account of the service in the temple, and it's awesome. Or the night of Passover in all its majesty at the time when the temple was still standing. Both the Day of Atonement and the Paschal festival is now a day, and we have no high priest, no sacrifices, no altar, and the whole temple service cannot take place, are devoid of all that holiness and glory with which they were endowed at the time of the temple. Both the way we do Yom Kippur and the way we do Pesach are only a pale image of the ideal construction that we're given on Mount Sinai. And by the way, you can see here, you know, Rabbi Soloveitchik, even when he's being intellectual, is poetic. You can see here Rabbi Soloveitchik's enormous yearning for the temple, for the perfection of the Torah and the service. It's quite remarkable. You see here this tremendous spirit. He's this great intellectual, but there's also this tremendous spirit and yearning in him. When Maimonides describes the order of events, so on the second paragraph that begins on page 26, when Maimonides describes the order of events on the 15th of Nisan, he forgets temporarily that he, that is Maimonides, is living approximately 1,000 years after the destruction of the temple, and paints the image of the service of this holy festival night. You can read it in Mishnah Torah. It's absolutely true. In a wealth of colors that dazzle the eye, that reflect the Passover services celebrated thousands of years ago in ancient Jerusalem, and as it once again will be celebrated in the era of Messiah. Rabbi Soloveitchik saw the coming of the Messiah as a real thing, the third temple as a real thing, and yearned for it every day of his life. Thus writes Maimonides in the Laws of Chometz and Matzah, chapter 8, paragraph 1. The order in which the aforementioned should be fulfilled on the night of the 15th of Nisan is as follows. First, a cup is mixed for each person, and he recites the blessing who has created the fruit of the vine, and he recites over it the sanctification of the day and drinks. This formulation is known to us from Orach Chaim, with Shulchan Aruch Chayei Adam, the prayer book of Yaakov Emden, the prayer book of Derech Chaim Rabbi Yaakov Lisa, the abridged Shulchan Aruch, and similar works. And its very ring calls to mind the ditty Kadesh Rochatz that we all sing before the Seder, so familiar to all school children. It would seem that the Laws of Chometz and Matzah, chapter 8, and an illustrated Haggadah, which one can buy for a few pennies, that was in 1952 when he wrote this. Now it's like $2. Differ only in style and phraseology. However, as we continue to read, we suddenly come across a peculiar Seder. And afterwards, he recites the blessing, and a table ready laid is brought in. They carry the table in, bearing a bitter herb and another vegetable, unleavened bread, charoset, and the body of the Paschal lamb, and meat from the festival offering of the day of the 14th. The Paschal lamb is a little lamb. If you have a big Seder, it's not enough for everyone to eat. So they would bring a larger animal, a ram or a bull, as a sacrifice also on the 14th. And that would be what they would eat for the meal, and then they would eat the Paschal lamb for dessert. Maimonides did not intend to set down the order of the performance of the commandments of the night of the 15th, but for the benefit of his generation, but rather for the pilgrims who went up to Jerusalem, who roasted their Paschal lambs and ate them with thanksgiving and praise. So it's really interesting. What he's saying is that Maimonides, that halachic man is beyond time. To Maimonides, he's talking in the realm of truth, which transcends time, and therefore he's talking to the people making a Seder 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years later. Similarly, when Maimonides continued his description, a second cup of wine is mixed. At that point, the son asks, why is this night different from all other nights? And there's an extra piece in the Manishtana. For on all other nights, we eat meat, roasted, stewed, or boiled, but tonight it's all roasted. He had in mind not the innocent child of his own day, who had reclined at his father's table in Cairo or Cordova, where there was neither a Paschal offering nor a festal offering, but rather he's speaking to the son who reclined at his father's table in ancient Jerusalem on the holy festival night, when the air would resound with the tones of the Hallel reciting over the eating of the Paschal lamb. And Maimonides' text continued this fashion later on. The table is then placed in front of him, and he says, this Paschal lamb from wheat is on account, and he says, the blessing, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the eating of the festival offering. And that's the festival offering. And then he eats first the festival offering, then he says the blessing, blessed are you concerning the eating of the Paschal offering, and he eats some of the body of the Paschal offering. Finally,
okay, what's this point?
1 minute. Finally, eats some more of the meat of the Paschal offering, even if only an olive's bulk, and does not taste anything more. That's the Afikomen. So the Seder with which, here's the point, on the bottom of page 27 going to page 28. The Seder in which Maimonides is dealing is an ideal conception of Passover night. Maimonides writes the laws as if he was in Beit HaMikdash, because Maimonides is not so interested in what do we do today as what is the ideal. What is the will and wisdom of God? What is the mind of God? Well, how does God see the ideal Seder? That's what he's interested in. Our great master, because as you know, the Soloveitchiks have a very intimate connection with Maimonides. The Soloveitchiks, since the first Soloveitchik was a Soloveitchik, have been studying and wrestling with Maimonides' works, in particular the Mishnah Torah. I'll tell you a funny story that I heard myself from Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik. Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik was the brother of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, lived in Chicago, tremendous scholar, and like his brother. So Rabbi Aaron once spoke. We finished, as you know, the Lubavitch Rebbe instituted the study of the whole Mishnah Torah every year, and at the second completion of the study cycle, there was a big event in the Javits Center in New York, and thousands of people were there from all over New York. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Aaron, came from Chicago to speak. And because the one who wrote this book, Rabbi Yosef Dov, was already ill. He wasn't able to come from Boston. So his brother came. So Rabbi Aaron said that his mother used to put his crib in the room where his father, Reb Moshe, was the father of Aaron and Yosef Dov. So he used to put his crib in the room where he would sit and study with his cronies. So he says, my first words weren't mommy or tati or food. My first words, because I heard them so much as a baby in the room where they studied, my first words were the Rambam is schwer, which is Yiddish for the Rambam is difficult. It's a difficult Rambam because the Soloveitchiks lived and breathed Rambam. So you have to understand that.
Rabbi, he was not the only one that fell in love with the Rambam. This whole group of Berlin, including your Rebbe that studied there, they were all Maimonides.
Absolutely.
And for all the reason, you can add to that Kant.
Yeah, and Leibovitch quotes the Rambam a lot.
Yeah,
even though he doesn't always agree with him.
He did, yeah.
But he wasn't part of that group. You know who was part of that group? His sister. Nechama Leibovitch was part of that group.
Yeah, she
Rabbi Hutner, Rabbi Soloveitchik, Nechama Leibovitch, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and one of the descendants of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. That was an amazing group of people. All in Berlin, all in university.
They had a big impact on modern Orthodoxy.
In so many ways. Yeah, anyways. But the point is, when he says our great master, I just wanted to share with you that, Maimonides wrote so perfectly and so precisely that every word he says can be interpreted and analyzed. It's like Shakespeare, lahavdil, to English. You know what I mean? There's just so much there. And the Soloveitchiks were the masters, of the Rambam. So when they say, our great master pays no, listen, this is so poetic. Our great master pays no attention to the cruel and bitter present. The picture of a restored Jerusalem, the temple in all its splendor, the priests at their service, and free Israelites performing the commandments of the night hovers before his eyes. This is where Maimonides lived. The ideal is more real to him than the sorrows of the present. However, from time to time, he bestirs himself from his ideal dream and romantic vision and finds himself confronted with an exile filled with nightmares and terrors, with physical oppression and spiritual degeneration. He states, in the present time, he does not say tonight's all roasted if we no longer have Paschal offering. In the present time, he says the Passover offering which our fathers used to eat when the temple was standing. In the present time, one adds, so Lord our God, bring to us other festivals, happy in the rebuilding of the city and joyous in thy service. And there may we eat of the sacrifice and Paschal offerings. In the present times, there's no offering, so after he cites who brings forth bread from the earth, he eats an olive's bulk of matzah, and doesn't eat any more after that. No Pesach lamb, but the afikomen. In other words, the present time is only an historical anomaly in the ongoing process of the actualization of the halach in the real world. In other words, these 2,000 years, they're an anomaly because time is meaningless to halachic man in the face of truth.
I just
want to say, the way in which, Jews have been so preoccupied with studying Torah as much as possible, and it's really remarkable. Look how Rabbi Soloveitchik sort of, makes it alive. That truth is so powerful. 2,000 years becomes an anomaly in a larger fabric of truth. This is just so powerful and beautiful.
It's poetic. It's whatever. But he should have mentioned in here, with all this glory of the temple and the Kohanim and all that, if we didn't have the period of Chazal for 800 years, there wouldn't have been any Judaism period. There were all these Kohanim in the temple. They became the first assimilists.
Well, it depends which time period, Joe.
So that was the problem with Rav Soloveitchik. He had these dreams, but never, he was not.
He was also pretty down to earth. But his point is that the study of Torah is the end of itself. The embrace of the ideal wisdom of God is an end in itself. He was also very practical about Israel and many other things. But
I know he was on the list to be the first president of the United States.
No, of Israel.
Of Israel, I mean.
Right. No, but he didn't want to be involved in politics. In other words, the present time is only a historical anomaly.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
They also offered it to Albert Einstein. They also offered it to Einstein.
Yeah, I know.
He also declined.
Chaim Weizmann was the right person.
In other words, the present time is only a historical anomaly in the ongoing process of the actualization of Adiyah Allah in the real world. But there's no need to elaborate about a period which is but a temporary aberration that has seized hold of our historical existence. The halacha remains in full force. The halacha remains. We just don't have something to apply it to. And we hope for and eagerly await the day of Israel's redemption when the ideal world will triumph over the profane reality. Because to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the redemption was a real thing every day of his life. And when halachic man stands up and prays, may it be your will that you will replenish the deficiency of the moon, it will no longer be diminished. In the prayer following the blessing over the new moon, he refers to the replenishing of the deficiency of the real cosmos, which does not correspond to the ideal image of reality. It's not about the moon. It's about the Jewish people are compared to the moon, and the deficiency of the moon is compared to the long night of exile. So when we ask God every month to repair the deficiency of the moon, we're asking God to repair the deficiency in Israel's glory and to restore the temple and the land of Israel and all those things. Halachic man's yearning for the national redemption, for the coming of the Mashiach, and for the building of the eternal temple draw upon his hidden longing for the full and complete realization of the ideal world in the very nub of concrete reality. If you remember, Maimonides argued that the reason why Judaism believes, we studied this together, people, that the reason why Judaism believes in the resurrection of the dead is because there's too many Jews who lived in times when they couldn't fulfill all the mitzvot related to the temple. So since the ultimate good is doing the mitzvot for God, their own sake, they need to be restored to life so they can live in an era when they can do all the mitzvot. That's what Maimonides says in Letters on Resurrection. Then
He lived 800 years ago.
In complete realization of the ideal world in the very nub of concrete reality. Rabbi Soloveitchik just explained to you that Maimonides transcends time. For that era, when halacha will shine in all its majesty and beauty in the midst of our empirical world, then all life will benefit from the image of this exalted and resplendent, divinely willed construction. In other words, then the world will match the halacha. In other words, we're not willing to give up the halacha because the world doesn't match it. We will continue studying and dwelling on the halacha because we know sooner or later the world will grow to match it. Halachic man's ideal is to subject realities to this yoke of halacha. However, long as this desire cannot be implemented, we don't have a temple. Halachic man does not despair, nor does he reflect at all concerning the clash of the real and ideal, the opposition which exists between theoretical law and the actual deed, between law and life. He goes his own way and does not kick against his lot and his fate. In other words, you keep on learning, you apply as you need to apply it, but he remains devoted to the truth for the sake of the truth. Such is also the way of the mathematician. And I'm not a mathematician, so now we're going to take Rabbi Soloveitchik's word for it, okay? When Reinman and Lobachevsky discovered the possibility of non-Euclidean space, which means space that doesn't conform to the usual rules of geometry we learned in 10th and 11th grade, they have an alternative space which doesn't actually exist in this room. They did not pay any attention to the existential space which we all live, in which we account with all our senses, which Euclidean from beginning to end, right? Lines and triangles all work according to Euclid. He was a smart dude. They were concerned with an ideal mathematical construction, and in that ideal world, they discerned certain features of geometric space different from ours. And afterwards, physicists such as Einstein and his circle appeared, and they utilized the concept of non-Euclidean space to explain certain physical phenomena. For example, now, I'm pretty sure, and I'm not a physicist, so don't hold me to it, that the concept of the curvature of space-time demands the use of non-Euclidean geometric ideas. Yes, however, according to modern epistemological doctrine, as many leading mathematical physicists such as Hertz, Einstein, Planck, and Eddington, who famously said the stuff of the universe is mind stuff. Eddington comes very close to God in his physics. Even the physicist does not simply photograph reality, but creates a world of constructs that only parallels a concrete empirical correlative, which means to say that the physicist's world doesn't necessarily match every detail of the world as we know it. It creates an ideal world that parallels our world. And that's why there, for example, fundamental contradictions between the very small, the quantum system, and the way physics works, at anything bigger than an atom. So there's in other words, obviously, we live in a single world in which there is a quantum reality and a macro reality. And obviously, they have to fit together somehow. But our constructs are not able to fit them together. We also have issues with gravity, with dark matter. There's a lot of issues that all make sense on their own mathematically, but don't fit together. Now we know they fit together because the universe exists, right? So, the Rabbi Soloveitchik's point is that there are many things in the ideal world of halacha, which at the moment don't have anything to apply to. And that doesn't bother halachic man, because to the halachic man, the ideal world of halacha, being the perfect parallel to God's mind, is more real than the concrete world. And unlike with physics, the concrete world ultimately will have to adjust itself to the halachic world.
Well,
and that ends chapter 6. So I would like, Yossel, I know you have something to say, but if anyone else would like to ask a question, make a comment on chapter 6, I'm very interested in hearing.
No, the only thing I would say, we've been at it trying to find it. It's known as the theory of everything. And,
unified field theory.
For close to 100 years almost, and we're still working on it. So it's going to be a while. I something on the side, when we read the detailed description that Rabbi Soloveitchik was describing Passover, and he's using the word mixing wine. So I know that there is such a discussion, right? That the wine should be mixed with water.
Yes, the wine let me explain to you. The wine in Talmudic times was very thick and very strong. I discussed this with a food microbiologist many years ago. Yeah. As an old man, I've had many discussions over the years, and basically, so you know that the strongest wine you can make today naturally is about 15%, because at 15%, the alcohol kills the microbes. Right. But he agreed with me that potentially there may have been other microbes that we no longer have that could stand greater concentrations of alcohol. So the wine in Talmudic times, in Mishnaic times, was very thick because there was a lot of evaporation in the aging process. It tended to be very thick, and it tended to be very strong, whatever very strong was. So you mix it with water to make it thinner and less strong.
Well,
I can tell you that even at the Seder, I remember once I was at a Seder where some of the denizens of the Seder, we had some Israeli dessert wine on the table, the 20% fortified wine that you can put a stick in. So they insisted on drinking all 4 cups from that wine. And after drinking 4 cups of that wine, they were completely blotto. So because they had big cups. So my point is that in order to avoid going blotto, whenever we made Kiddush or back in the Mishnaic and Talmudic times, this very thick, very strong wine, because remember, they didn't have sulfites to stop the fermentation. So the wine fermented until it was the highest possible alcohol content. And it was very thick. So they always added wine. To this day, Sephardim, if you've ever been at a Sephardic Kiddush, they add a drop of wine before they say the bracha. And this is mezigah. So the mixing the wine with water was always done. It was considered
a drop of water.
Yeah, but then they added up to a third water or 2/3 water because it was so strong and so thick, it wasn't good to drink it on its own.
15-20% wine is what we call today the Portos.
Right. But those are fortified with alcohol. But in the times of the Mishnah, it could be they had bacteria that would get you, yeast that would get you to 20%. So at any rate, it was very strong and very thick, so we added water. Just a little note. And that's why pouring a cup is always called meziga mixing. Also, the wine went further that way. And also, the other reason why they let it evaporate, why they let it get thick, was because that enabled you to carry more wine, which you later diluted with water. It was like a concentrate, basically.
That was discovered almost by mistake because the wines were being shipped from Italy to Britain. By the time it got there, it was already at 15+%, and they loved it.
Yes.
That's what they're drinking.
Yes, I know. As a matter of fact, you could not get good kosher sherry import in this country, but in England you can get it.
Exactly.
Really good. There was once a charity event that a colleague of mine was invited to with his wife. I was in England at the time, and it was like a 1,000 pound, that's $1,500 a plate event. And so he took me there because his wife wasn't feeling well. And they had all these meats that you never ever saw in your life, kosher, of course. And they had these wines. I'll tell you, normally I can't tell the difference between a $10 bottle of wine and a $30 bottle of wine.
Oh, there is a big difference. There is a big difference.
Between a $10 bottle of wine and a $100 bottle of wine, I can tell the difference. So what I'm saying is so you can get good sherry import in the UK, kosher. At any rate, going back to the point, that's why they mix the wine with water. Just a little aside. The Talmud claims, and it may be an exaggeration, but they once saw the bones of a man who insisted on drinking his wine raw without water, and his bones were charred black. It's probably an exaggeration, but so is it written. Okay. Now, we have number 7. And in number 7, let me introduce number 7. We'll begin it next week. That we're now going to talk about a difficult topic. Till now, the homo religiosus, we didn't really divide the religious man from the halachic man. We mostly divided the halachic man from the empirical man. But now we're going to talk about, how people sometimes say, myself included, Judaism isn't a religion? Well, in a way, that's true, because what we call religiosity, which Rabbi Soloveitchik defines as the homo religiosus, the religious man, is very different from the halachic man. For example,
I hope so.
For example, what is, if you look at most monotheistic religions, or even Buddhism and Hinduism and so on, what is the ultimate goal of life? whether you're a Muslim, a Christian, a Hindu, what's the ultimate goal of life? Who knows?
Be close to God.
Well,
Yeah, but what's the goal? Paradise, life in the world to come. A better incarnation, nirvana, right? The goal is something beyond this life. Now, Judaism believes in the world to come.
well, that's not everybody's definition.
Were you talking about the Christians or about the Jews?
No, I'm even thinking about myself. The one thing that I know what I'm leaving behind, the children and the grandchildren, and hopefully they're going to continue being good Jews and learning and whatever. Everything else is speculation.
Well, but it's a fundamental principle of Jewish faith and alluded to many times in the Tanakh that there's a life after death.
It's alluded, but never really mentioned in the
it's
Torah.
a fundamental. It's certainly part of the Torah Shabbat Peh. Joe, there's simply no debate about this among traditional Jews. However, in other words, there isn't a single traditional authority who rejects the idea of the world to come. However, the big idea is that in Judaism, the goal, the world to come, is the result, and it's a reward, and so on. But the goal is the observance of halacha in this world. And that's what he's gonna dwell on. The ultimate purpose of Judaism, even though the soul existed for thousands of years before and exists for thousands of years after, the ultimate purpose of Judaism is this flash, this brief moment that we spend in this world and the good we do in this world. The goal is not the world to come. The goal is this world. The world to come is incidental.
Yeah, that's exactly what I just said.
No, you weren't sure about the whole world to come thing at all, which Maimonides is very sure.
I would be the first one very happy. If there is I go and, I meet my wife and...
Hey, Yossel, you got another 35 years till 120, so let's not rush.
I know. But I know who the first one is going to come running toward me.
Yeah, I don't doubt.
It's not going to be my wife.
Who's it going to be?
My dog.
I'm afraid that I'm not sure that dogs have immortal souls, but whatever. I won't argue that with you, Yossel. People are very attached to their dogs, but let's go on. So I want to say, so what we're going to talk about over here is, and there are other aspects in which the religious man lives in a spiritual realm. And to him, the spiritual realm is more real than the physical. To halachic man, the deepest spiritual ideas are realized specifically in the physical world. And as we said, even though sometimes the physical world doesn't have a vehicle to match, that's like, God forbid, let's say someone is paralyzed. So we know that the brain, that the capacity for movement exists within the brain. It's just not transmitting to the body. So, it's the same thing, that there are things in halacha which are real, but don't have a vessel in this day and age. But we're very much, halacha on one hand is ideal, on the other hand, it's very much concentrated on the real world. And this is the gist of this next chapter, which is really, I think, where the novel features of Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought come to the fore. Because he's explaining Judaism, even though you'll see these ideas and say, yeah, I recognize them, but he's bringing them out in a way I don't think they've been brought out before. So
yes, I'm looking forward to reading it.
Okay, so let's just read a few lines.
Why?
What? Halachic's man relation to transcendence, chapter 7, page 30, differs from that of the universal homo religiosus. Halachic man does not long for a transcendent world, for supernal levels of a pure, pristine existence. For it's not the ideal world. Halachic man's his darling desire, created only for the purpose to be actualized in our real world. Even though we can't do the Korban Pesach today, why does the law of the Korban Pesach exist? So that one day we should be able to do it in the real world.
Okay. Rabbi, know, that's pretty amazing. We just went through reading the previous chapters, and he was all involved in the temple and the past and all this. And now he's finally coming down to the real world. Really?
Yes, because the point is that halacha exists to be actualized in the real world, even if it never is. That's why it exists. So, for example, the laws of Passover exist to be actualized in the temple. Right now, we don't have a temple, and that doesn't bother halachic man. But halachic man also knows the whole purpose of the halach is ultimately to apply it to the real world when the opportunity presents itself.
Exactly.
In other words, the statement that if Ruvain says this and Shimon says this, the law is this, even if it never happens, that law exists because conceptually such a thing could happen. In other words, the entire focus of the halacha is this world, even if this world is presently not a vessel for it. That is the complexity. In chapter 6, he addressed the fact that we don't actually need the real world for halacha to be real. On the other hand, the entire purpose of halacha is envisioning itself in the real world. It remains true even if we don't have the real world actualization, but it speaks in terms of the real world. Halacha exists only in the frame of reference of the real world, whether we can do it today or not.
Yeah,
and it is this dichotomy, this ability to contain these two ideas that seem to contradict but don't, as one, which is the essence of this book.
Rabbi, I don't understand because, okay, we had a temple, we know our history. We had a temple, we brought korbanot, but we already know that the temple and the halach and the korbanot were changed into batei knesiot, into synagogues, and into prayers.
They weren't changed. They are a partial and imperfect replacement.
Imperfect replacement.
Partial and imperfect and lacking.
Well, I am one that I would not want to see a third temple with korbanot.
Well, Yossel, that's because you never experienced it. Once you walk in there the first time and you see and you feel the divine presence in the korban, you see the divine creative energy that made that lamb exist.
Rabbi,
revealed, 1 minute, you'll flip out and you will be so happy that you have a temple.
I don't think so.
No,
The first time I'm going to smell burning flesh, I can tell you I'm going to be thinking of something completely different.
No, you won't.
It's not going to be the korbanot.
No, you won't, because with the redemption and with the joy of the redemption, you won't be thinking about those things anymore. I promise you.
Rabbi, do you really think that with our modern way of thinking or thought that we will be accept, like Joe says, and be comfortable with the idea of sacrifice?
Well,
sacrifice, excuse me, does sacrifice really apply in today's world? You're talking about people thousands of years ago when maybe living was hard, getting food was hard, and who God doesn't need the sacrifice. The food would go to the priests and so forth. Is there still a need for that now? There's other kind of sacrifices other than life, than an animal.
So the answer is that Maimonides argues that the primary reason for sacrifices is because that's how people worshipped, and God didn't want to take them away from them. But then Maimonides says that there are certain sacrifices that remain for reasons known only to God, which he doesn't elaborate on at all. It's one line in his long soliloquy about why originally sacrifices were made to keep people happy, because they used it. So, but if you look at the mystical writings, they explain the sacrifices as I have, and there's a deep spiritual thing going on there, and it's the idea basically of the return of the reconstituting of something, or deconstituting of the animal or the handful of flour from its physical state to the divine energy that created it. And that experience, to see the act of creation in reverse, to see that everything is truly created by God at every moment, is an incredible experience. And that's how the Kabbalists explain it. And therefore, it's not just a barbecue. That being said, there are plenty of people who have no trouble eating chicken soup. If you have no trouble eating chicken soup, you shouldn't have a trouble using an animal.
What about the Orthodox vegans? They're going to go crazy. They'll be in a dilemma because they can't really.
Well, they can always bring a meal offering, right?
Okay, that's another thing. Is a meal offering okay? All right,
Of course.
Okay.
The only exception is when Mashiach comes, every Jewish vegan will have to eat 1 olive size of meat a year, because there's a biblical commandment subject to the soul being cut off if you don't do it, to eat a kazayat of the Korban Pesach, an olive size of the Korban Pesach.
What about pretend meat if it's kosher?
Well, you can't. There has to be a lamb. Can't be a pretend lamb.
All right. Well, I will. I'll cross
You know what? But here's the point. When Mashiach comes, you'll see things differently because you'll see the purpose. Right now, trying to, it's like me going to the deepest jungles of the Amazon and finding an uncontacted tribe and try to explain the taste of pistachio ice cream to them. They'll love it if you give it to them, but they have no idea what you're talking about. Their delicacy is roasted beetle larvae. You know what I mean? So, it's no knock on them, but we're like those uncontacted tribes. We have no idea what the experience in the temple is like. So, so it's all good questions, except that we're talking our present frame of reference, which is a totally different frame of reference when the temple is restored. But we will explore the intense focus of the halachic man on the real world in the God willing next week. Except that next week we're not having a class because I have some shul business to attend to, a seminar that I have to go to with one of the presidents. So I will not be. So Sunday I'm out next Sunday. So we'll meet in 2 Sundays hence. Yes, Michael.
So I get the Chabad. This is totally unrelated, and I know it's at the end of the class.
Whoever wants to go can go. Whoever wants to stay can stay.
So I have an article. I get the newsletter from Chabad.org, and there's an article about Rabbi Shmuel of Lubavitch. And I wanted you to explain to me what exactly Chabad is. Is it a movement? Is it a group of people? What is it about this movement and the progression of rabbis from one generation to another?
That's a long story but basically it is a school of thought and a movement that had a series of expositors and followers from about the year 1773 until this day, though the last rabbi passed away in 1994, but the movement continues.
Are they similar to the old schools of the old rabbis in medieval times or in biblical times?
Yes and no. They're a particular Hasidic group. I studied in their yeshivot. My family belongs to this movement, so I can tell you a lot about it. But it's a long story. But basically, it is a very intellectually directed Hasidic movement. You will notice that it's sort of the only Hasidic sources that Rabbi Soloveitchik quotes are from Chabad. It's very focused on understanding Judaism from an intellectual perspective, but using not just the approach of the philosophers, but also the Kabbalists and so on. I can explain more another time.
Okay, but do you also make your own decisions as far as interpretation of Bible too, as well?
So when it comes to interpreting the Torah, and this is something Joe knows a lot about, there's 2 levels. One is the halachic interpretation, in which we're bound by the Talmud and by those who came before us, and though there are debates, but generally speaking, we're bound by tradition. Then there is the right of every single Jew to interpret what the Torah teaches us morally, ethically, historically, spiritually, and that every day there's new commentaries and new thoughts. You're entitled to come up with your own thought, and so on. So the interpretation of the Torah is something that we each should do for ourselves. When it comes to the do's and don'ts, the practical life, obviously, you need a system. But
Okay.
just the opposite. The more one learns, the more one is involved in the intellectual analysis of Torah, the more likely you are to come up with meaningful commentaries of your own.
Well, the reason I ask is because my roots are your roots, and the
Yeah.
Ashkenazi Jews here are all my ancestors. And what I'm learning now about myself and my family that came before me is part of this movement and part of wherever this evolved, but they all came from Russia or the Ukraine, and they all practice the same way. And I've never known that until now. I've had inklings, but this apparently is part of my family, my culture.
Oh, for sure.
I never
Russia,
knew about.
Ukraine, definitely. But even the Litvaks, even the non-Hasidim, they're part of this larger Ashkenazic group that Hasidim, Litvaks, basically that everyone who isn't Sephardic belongs to.
Okay.
So yeah, and we can see more of this. And Rabbi Soloveitchik represents the acme of the whole Lithuanian school that we're studying. But as you see, he synthesizes Sephardic and Hasidic sources too. And that's his greatness. And we'll do more of this, God willing, in 2 weeks. Yeah, Michael.
Well, I just wanted to say that this journey that I'm on now is actually discovering my roots and discovering that the Russians that are in Temple that came, and like Joe and like Greg, they're all part of where I came from, and that things that I never knew before and cultural things that I never knew. And explain to somebody that Jewish food is not really Jewish food, it's really Eastern European food.
Right, except made kosher.
Well, you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, of course.
Let's not split hairs, what I'm saying, which is not kosher. Well, what I'm saying is the foods that people normally associate with Jews are not really Jewish food to someone
Correct.
that grew
And
up
if you
in
live
England.
among Moroccan Jews, you have a whole different cuisine.
Right, exactly.
I'll conclude with a funny story about that. So you know that Ashkenazic food tends to be more salty and savory, but
Yes.
Sephardic food tends to be very spicy.
Okay, I don't know.
So the story goes that, in Israel, Ashkenazim and Sephardim live in the same buildings. So the story goes that at the beginning of COVID, a Sephardic family went to their Ashkenazic neighbors to have Shabbat lunch. And on the way back, and as soon as they returned, they immediately quarantined themselves because they couldn't taste anything. Okay,
thank you.
On that note, have a wonderful week, everyone. And Monday morning, we have live minyan, Zoom minyan, Talmud. No Talmud. Tuesday, we have Talmud and the weekly Parsha at 12:30. And also the Haftarah at night at 7:45.
Thank you, Joe. Yassel, thank you for, I really appreciate you.
Very good. Now listen,
thank you very much. I appreciate
thank you all for showing up and all for your comments, and we shall continue. We're now in the nitty-gritty. And we're having, and now that Rabbi Soloveitchik stopped using 20-syllable words, we're all understanding it better too.
Labriot, Rabbi, Labriot. Thank you, dear.